Oh, just hang on. I've got issues.
Oh dear.
Which are going to go away right now. Hopefully that should be okay. So I'm back with you. So again, welcome to everybody, and especially the visitors from Australia. They've got up very early in the morning to be with us, so I'm sure we're going to enjoy William's talk, and I'm sure it's going to be about sport. Is that right, William?
Yes, I'm an amateur sports photographer.
We're in your hands, sir.
Right. What I'll do is I'll mute everybody, then allow William to share his screen, and then you'll have to unmute yourself to actually speak. Okay.
Well, if you just press the space bar.
Well, you probably won't want to do that.
Oh, well, sorry.
Right. Right, William, you should be able to share your screen now.
Now you're getting this, the actual
Yeah, we've got
first slide, are you?
We've got your
the first
screen.
slide.
You haven't got my notes down this side.
No.
Right.
Only
Good.
we've got the screen to slide.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to your camera club on the subject of sports photography, and also for the introduction that we've had this morning. And one of the reasons I'm talking about sports photography is because it's my passion as an amateur sports photographer. There are many photographers that have one style of photography that takes up most of their photographic interest, and mine is sports photography. And the reason I enjoy sports photography is because sports photography allows you to be more involved in the action. You can be right there taking images when the athlete breaks the record. You can capture the emotional triumph or the disappointment of defeat. You can also photograph the thrills and spills, which adds excitement to any sport. Though none of us, of course, like to see an athlete or an animal injured. Then there are the friends I make. Most of the people in the wheelchair sports, when they're talking to me, just call me the Rev. On one occasion, I remember one of the wheelchair athletes was coming out of the stadium. As I was just about to go in, he turned around and raced back in saying, "The Rev is here." Well, I took that to be a compliment. I assume that's what it was and not a warning, here he comes. And anyone interested in sport, of course, has their favourite sports and athletes, and disabled sports is mine in particular because I'm a voluntary photographer for Wheelchair Sports New South Wales. This chap is Abs. He was born without arms as well as other problems. He's 26. He weighs just 17 kilos, and he's the best power chair football player in the world. He operates his chair with his feet. He uses his phone with his feet, and he picks his nose with his big toe. Well, when you haven't got fingers, you've got to do it with something. Now, this is Kurt Fernley. You may have heard of Kurt, a wheelchair racer. He was born in Cowra, New South Wales, one of our country towns just out the other side of Orange. But he comes from a little town called Carcoar in New South Wales, not far from Cowra, but the main part of the town is under the National Heritage Trust. He was born with a disability. His parents refused to place him in an institution when they were advised to do so when he was born. He grew up crawling around the family farm, and he became one of the greatest wheelchair athletes in the world. Now, Karkor had a population in 2016 of 200, and they raised money to send him to his first overseas event. And I don't know whether you've heard of the Kokoda Trail or the Kokoda Track in New Guinea, a very important wartime track, and he's crawled the length of the Kokoda Trail. Kurt says he owes his success to his family and also to the people of Karkor, because they just kept telling him that he could do anything he wanted. And when they sent him overseas, they raised $10,000 out of a town of 200 to pay for his trip. He's, by profession, he's a school teacher, and he's also seen now on Australian national television in a one-on-one program. Riley Batt is the chap on the right in the blue. Riley was born in May 1989 without legs, but he also had to have surgery to separate his webbed fingers. He is about the only athlete in our wheelchair rugby team, international one, that was born with a deficiency. Most of the others are a result of accidents or of illnesses. Now, Riley lived on a skateboard in his hometown of Port Macquarie and had no interest when he was a kid in getting into a wheelchair. It wasn't until he was about 12 years old he was convinced to use a wheelchair when he saw a demonstration of the wonderful sport of wheelchair rugby at his school. And he took up the sport that year. And of course, us Australians would say that he's the best wheelchair rugby player in the world. Now, to play wheelchair rugby at the international level and at the national level, you must have something wrong with 3 of your limbs. They may be missing, they may be amputated. So many people end up playing wheelchair rugby after they've had meningococcal. And this young chap, Harry Clist. Harry now lives in Port Macquarie, where he's coached by Riley Batt. Harry started wheelchair rugby in 2013 when he was 9. In 2017, he became Wheelchair Sports New South Wales Rookie of the Year. And Harry is now a very accomplished wheelchair rugby player, and he's also an experienced public speaker and regularly gives talks to prove that wheelchair users can do whatever they want to do, not just in sport, but also in life. If you know New South Wales at all, his father used to bring him down from Bathurst in the early days to play in Sydney, and now his father brings him down from Port Macquarie to play in Sydney. If you don't know where they are, look it up on a map of Australia and you'll see it's quite a distance just to come down. Of course, most parents of wheelchair athletes give a lot of time to their children. You may ask, what do I do with my images? Well, the first thing I do with my images is I put them on my P-Base webpage. They'll go there for probably about 12 months. And any of the athletes that I photograph are welcome to download the photos. They're also welcome to send me an email if they want to have larger copies, larger resolution copies of the photos. Usually with wheelchair sports, I'm the only one who's there to photograph. And I can be photographing wheelchair sports at least once a week, if not more often on many occasions. Because they also get used in brochures by the sport, in this case by Wheelchair Rugby League. When they're putting out a brochure, they ask me for copies of the photographs so they can produce them in there. And now we have my local paper, the Western Weekender, and they're used in there also in other newspapers to publicise the sport. They've been used in the Sydney Telegraph and the Western Australia paper and many other papers. And even now that we only get one local paper here in Penrith, whereas when I came back in 2006, we had about 5 local papers coming. We still get publicity in that way. You'll also see them on sports websites in Australia and overseas. This one comes off the Power Chair hockey website in Canada. They were out here last year and played matches against Australia and against the States and took part in our local national club competition. And then they're also being used on television at times.
When you first feel the basketball, the weather, the fingertips kind of go, yep, fine, no one's going to take it away. I'm a very emotional person when I play. If someone's getting on my case a bit, I do tend to flip them out of the chair. The thing that motivates me the most is when people tell me I can't do something. I had to do a lot of one-on-one training by myself. Really just getting someone there to push me was really hard, so I had to kind of push myself and make sure that I worked as hard as I could. The adrenaline kicks in a bit more if I make a good stop or play some really good defense. I can push harder. I'll put my body on the line. I hurt for a little while, but it's a good feeling when it falls through.
If you have a wheelchair group in your district, I'm sure that if they haven't got a photographer, they'd like someone to come down and take photographs. I don't charge for my photographs. If there's a professional photographer in attendance, well, that's a different matter and I don't publicise them the same. I'm not in competition with professionals who earn their money by their photography. Now, this is Riley Batten. I gave a copy of this print to Riley's mother and she was overjoyed. And later on in the day, Riley came over to me and said, you know, you made my day and you made my mother's day. She was just so excited to have this particular photo of Riley crossing the line in the wheelchair rugby. And then I also use them in competitions and exhibitions on a local level, the national level, international level, and I've also had a couple in the Castle Exholm biannual exhibitions, and I use them in my talks on photography that I especially do in talks on sports photography. Now, one of the things you need to do when you're doing sports photography is you need to know your camera. When you're out there photographing action sports, you don't have time to dig out your camera manual to see how to set the camera for what you want. You need to know how to do it automatically. If you spend time fiddling around with your camera or camera manual, you could miss some interesting and important shots. You may even miss what the professionals call the money shot. So make sure you know your camera. And always check your gear before you go. This seems to be an obvious statement, but I don't know how many times I've met people at events who have left some of their gear at home, maybe one of their lenses, a flash unit or a tripod or monopod, if they use them, or they've run out of battery because they didn't charge them before they left home. Because one of the photographers I met ran out of battery and he used the same battery I did, I was able to lend him one of my spares for a while. check your gear before you go. Know what gear you will need. I use Canon cameras. I know a lot of others use Nikon, and there's a lot of other cameras that people use. But I use a 70 to 200 f2.8 millimeter, f2.8 to catch the action, and an 85 1.8 to catch the action. And the 25 104 f4 mainly used for presentation and team photos. And flash, I only use the flash for presentations and team photos. Never use flash when you're taking photos of the sports people themselves in action, even in stadiums. If you do so, you could disrupt the player. You do so, you could be asked to stop using the flash, or you could even be ejected from the event. And I don't use a monopod or a tripod for sports photography, and I'll explain that to you a little bit later. Now, know the sport that you're going to photograph. Whatever sport you're going to photograph, you need to know the sport. You need to know the basic rules, the way the game is played, which shots are the best ones to get, which ones show the action in the best way, which are the most important shots. Study the sport you'll be shooting in action, and you want to understand the sport well enough that you can predict upcoming moves and action. You need to know where the best locations are to capture them. I know sometimes when you're at an event, you'll probably be given a spot and told stay there. But it depends on the level of the sport. You can move around and find the spot that you want to be in to catch the action you want. This is our Eastern Creek Raceway, or the Sydney Motorsports Park. And this is a park I've been to several times. And when I go there to catch the action, I go down to corner number 2, as you can see down on the bottom left-hand corner there. Corner number 2 is where you can get a few shots of action, such as the cars coming around that corner. Could have been a much more serious situation if the marshal hadn't been there in time to stop the other cars from ploughing into the car that was having problems. Now, I missed the rider coming off this bike, but I got a couple of shots of the bike going end over end. And that was down at corner 2. Now, I start for panning. I usually get up to where it is in the panning there, where I've got it indicated. I like doing panning shots in my sports photography. We have here a couple of cars were taken from that particular point. As you can see how the background is blurred and the wheels are blurred. And of course, they have different events down there, from V8s right through to vintage cars. And it's also used for other things. Now, as you can see, there's plenty of track there. There's plenty of places for people to stand. And people, when they get to a track like this, just need to seek out where they want to be to get the images they want. Now, the next place we go to is the Sydney International Equestrian Centre. It's one of the many 2,000 Olympic venues that were retained in Sydney after the Games. Sydney retained, as far as I'm aware, all the Sydney Olympic venues, so that they're still widely used by those who are interested in those various sports. And when you go to the Equestrian Centre, of course, they have the cross-country courses. And when you're at the cross-country, you need to know what jumps there are. You need to know where they are. You need to know what colour the tags are for the different classes, so you'll know which one of the jumps in that area they'll be using. You can even go for a course walk before the events to look at all the jumps. And you can usually find maps of these online for the event that you're going to. Here we have the water jump. Here we have another jump set up. The chap on this particular horse is Shane Rose, one of our Olympians. And whenever we're there, I'm looking out for Shane. Most of the time you can pick him out because he wears the same shirt with those lines on it. So he's easy to pick out and he's a lovely bloke to talk to. Now, before you go to an event, obtain permission from the event organiser. Failure to obtain permission can result in antagonism. It can result in the event organiser asking you to leave. There was I've been going to Sydney International Equestrian Centre so often that I just turned up one day and the lady in charge of that got most upset when she heard I'd been photographing there. We eventually ironed things out and I'm welcome to go anytime, but I always tell her I'm going or ask before I go. Because if you don't ask, you can be kicked out or asked to move. I mentioned one particular wheelchair event to some people I know. They came without asking permission of the organiser and they were asked to move and go back up into the stand to take the photos. Of course, there are some events you don't need to ask the organiser, like the Sydney Australia Day 10-kilometre race around the rocks, because there are so many vantage points around there, but you won't get near people. Now, asking permission can also affect where you stand. Are you going to be up in the stand and have to take photos from a long distance and also with people's heads in the way? Asking permission could mean you could be standing down on the side of the arena where you haven't got people in front of you. Or they could even mean being on the arena if you have a media pass. And for a lot of these events, I ask for a media pass. They're not only given to the media, they're given to other people who they know quite well. So don't forget, ask permission, and it makes it a lot smoother. You get to know the organisers as well as the athletes. And be aware of where you are. Now, I said before, I don't use a monopod or a tripod. If I'd been using a monopod or a tripod in this incident, I mightn't have been here talking to you today. This horse and rider decided they weren't going to follow the course. And when they came to the water jump, instead of going directly across in front of me, he came out right at me. And I managed to get one shot before I then jumped behind another jump that wasn't being used, and hopefully he wasn't going to use. If I'd had a monopod or a tripod, I would never have been able to get out of the way in the time. And watch out for backgrounds. Sometimes the backgrounds don't matter. Sometimes they spoil the shot. I heard a story recently about a wedding photographer. After the service in the church, they came outside and he took all these wonderful photos outside the church of the bride and the groom and the various shots that the photographers take. And when the people got the photographs back from the photographer, they noticed in the background was the notice board of the church. And the notice board of the church had the text for the next Sunday's sermon on it. And the text was, "Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do." Hopefully they're able to get rid of that out of the back of a lot of their photographs. So I'm sure they knew exactly what they were doing. And now you need to learn to pan, to show the action and the speed of the athletes. You can see there the wheels, spokes of the wheels blurred. You can see the backgrounds blurred. You can also use panning with your nature shots or with your travel photography. Now, this is a static image. I could have just set it up for the occasion. I could have just asked him, oh, you go out there and sit there? He was actually in a race, but how could you tell? No action at all, no other athletes around him. Who knows what was going on if you just see that photo by itself. Now this image, the one I showed you a few moments ago, one of the judges who came out to our club and saw this image asked if it had been done in Photoshop. He said the subject was so well in focus. And I said, well, why not? That's what I was aiming for, to get the subject in focus while you showed the motion of the athlete. Now, the next series of 8 photographs will show Madison on a bike 101 passing the other athletes. Madison, when she was 14, was in the Paralympics in China and won a silver medal in the relay. Can you pass me my water? Now, how do you get the action like this, where the rider and the horse are very well focused and the background is out of focus? First of all, you set your camera to shutter priority. The shutter speed will vary, of course, upon the speed of the subjects. You'll also need a higher shutter speed the closer the subject is to your position, because this makes the speed much greater relatively to you. Keep the focus point on the same part of the subject. In this case, the head of the athlete, the one from Canada, and the one from New Zealand's on the other side. And then we have the same spot on a vehicle as you follow through. The direction of travel, the subject needs to be travelling perpendicular to the direction you are shooting. As you begin, you continue through following the subject, keeping the camera as steady as possible on the one point on the subject. When you get to that centre bit, continuous shooting, because you'll take a few photos at that stage and then continue the sweep when you're finished shooting. Position yourself so that you're facing the point you're focused on. Turn your body so you can pick up the subject as early as possible as it travels across in front of you. Swivel smoothly, keeping the subject in the same position in the frame for as long as it travels past you. To get the smoothest pan, you should try to swivel from your hips rather than just the shoulders. Fire the camera continually in the middle of the movement when the subject is there directly in front of you. And remember to continue shooting. Remember to continue panning after you're finished shooting. Because if you stop too early, you can create a jerky movement that will spoil your movement photography. Here are just a couple of samples that were taken of people in wheelchair races or running races. The para-triathlon down in Penrith Regatta Centre. I took this photo earlier this year and I put it on my P-base pages, and a few days later someone put a comment on the page that they loved the movement shown in this photo. Whether it was the person actually on the bike or someone else, I'm not sure. There'll always be times when you want to have a shot of indoor photography or nighttime sport. And when we come to those situations, there are other things we've got to remember. Now, remember, I'm talking about stadiums here within the Sydney region and just out of Sydney. I don't know what they're like in England or in Axelholm. This is the Liverpool Catholic Club, and various often when you go to one of these stadiums, one or two or more lights won't be working. So you need to keep that in mind. Check the lighting of the venue, as the lighting varies quite a lot from stadium to stadium, because stadiums have different levels of lighting requirements depending on the standard of the matches to be played there. Kiama Sports Complex, which is down in the south coast past Wollongong, has very bad lighting. There are no skylights in the roof, and in the main room where they play basketball, there is just one narrow strip of lights across one wall to get any natural light that might be available. But other stadiums, such as Kevin Bett Stadium in Mount Druitt and Shellharbour City Stadium, have skylights, and it's wonderful to photograph in those places because there is so much natural light coming through those skylights. And of course, dull days will often affect the amount of light. And of course, with the skylights, as clouds go over, that also affects the amount of light coming in. Poorly lit stadiums, you might require an ISO of 3,200. That's what I needed to set down at Kiama. At Penrith Ice Palace, I needed 4,000. Better lit stadiums can let you go down to a 1,600 ISO or even lower with a shutter speed of 1/500th. And that applies at those two well-lit stadiums. Now, these two top photos were taken at Mount Druitt Stadium. One was taken at 1,600 and one at 3,200. Now, Wheelchair Rugby League decided they were going to play some of their games at the Western Sydney University on the basketball courts outside. So the lighting was atrocious. I even had to go up to 6,400 ISO and 12,800 ISO, something I would rarely, if ever, do. And I was forced to on that occasion just because of the poor lighting situation. Now, when it comes to ice hockey, and I was a photographer for both the Sydney Bears ice hockey team and also the Sydney Ice Dogs ice hockey teams, and I found that if you did an automatic did a custom white balance, you got a better image than if you'd used the automatic white balance. So when it's custom white balance or preset manual on Nikon, getting the right light balance will help prevent the ice from looking dirty or grey or even coloured effect. But when you do this, when you take the custom white balance, wait till all the lights in the arena are turned on and at full strength. Wait till after the warm-up and before the Zamboni cleans the ice. Point the camera towards a well-lit section of ice and make sure there are no coloured lines in the frame. Take 2 shots while the athletes warm up. Take one on auto white balance. Then take one on custom white balance. And if you don't know how to do this, Google it or check your manual. But do so before you get there and check which one is the best shot. Something else to do is what other camera settings you're going to use in sports photography. RAW or JPEG, continuous shooting or one shot, focus points, back button focus, continuous focus, the depth of field for images to stand out from the background. RAW or JPEG? Personally, I shoot in RAW because it contains more detail than the JPEG images. And because disk space is much cheaper today than it used to be. Years ago, I bought an 80 meg hard drive that cost me $1,600, and I was told I would never fill the 80 meg hard drive. A couple of years ago, my wife went down to one of the local retailers and asked what price their 1 terabyte hard drive was. And the salesman said, oh, he doesn't need anything that big. You'd never fill it. Well, I'm sure he hasn't seen my photography collection. I use 4 megabyte hard drives these days. But when we're talking about RAW or JPEG, some professional photographers will shoot in JPEG. They have to shoot in JPEG. They have to get the images to the paper or the magazine or online quickly. They don't have time to take them home. They don't have time to sit in front of a computer at this sports venue and go through their raw photos. And of course, JPEG has less colour options. It also has a narrow dynamic range. We'll continue shooting or one shot. I use either of them depending on the sport and the shot I want to get. Also remember, the more times you use continuous, the greater number of images you'll have to process. A note of caution: be careful how many images you take. I went to one event, and I'll show you some photos from that later, of the disabled sailing. We were put into a rubber dinghy. We went out to take photographs. I took about 500 images. The other photographer in the boat said he took over 5,000 in the same time frame with the same subjects. I know who's going to be spending much longer sitting on the computer going through the images. This image was, and the next one were taken on continuous shooting. It allowed me to select which shots I wanted at the time. Continuous shooting, where I was able to pick out the image I wanted. This is at the water jump I showed you before. And as you see, the rider is having a bit of difficulty staying on the horse, but eventually he did get back up onto the horse without falling off. And with shots like this, I use one shot. I watch the player, I see how fast they swing, and I endeavoured to get them serving with the tennis ball and the racket touching or very close together, with just a slight blur on the racket head and the ball. Now, of course, I did try to do this with doing continuous shooting, but I failed time and time again, and decided that practicing taking the one shot was much easier and was much more rewarding. What focus points are you going to use? Now, this is the Canon 5D Mark IV. You have the linear points, the cross type points, and you have the dual cross type points. And I mainly use the dual cross type points when I'm focusing the camera. Your camera manual will tell you what you have. And of course, the cross type AF points and the dual cross type AF points are the best ones to use when you're doing sports photography. Now, I don't know how many of you use back button focus. I find it very good. It assists me a great deal. I use it all the time these days. And if you haven't tried it, give it a try. When you get used to it, you'll more than likely continue to use it. Back button focus allows you to easily lock the focus on the athlete that you're focusing on. Take your finger off the back button and you'll lock the focus. That helps prevent focus errors For example, if you're shooting a soccer game and a player moves in the foreground, you can release the back button to maintain the focus on the original subject. And talking about soccer, I heard on the news this morning that Maradona died at the age of 60. Continuous focus. In back button focus, you're continually focusing until you take your finger off the button and then it locks the focus, which is good for sports photography as athletes are usually always on the move. So keep your finger on the button and press the shutter button, the shutter release, when you want to take the image. Back button focusing focuses, the shutter button takes the image. And if you don't know how to do that, Google your particular camera or get your manual out and it'll show you what to do. We don't have time to go through all that at the moment. Our depth of field. When it comes to depth of field, do you want your images to stand out from the background? If you do, you need to have a shallow depth of field. As you know, we have the focusing distance, the focus point, the narrow depth of field. The narrow depth of field can give you a sharp image throwing the background out, whereas a larger depth of field will show everything in focus. And you don't particularly want all the trees in the background overbearing the photo of the horse doing the jump. F-stop. The lower the f-stop, the narrower the depth of field, the higher the f-stop, the larger the depth of field. Distance from the target, the shorter distance to narrow the depth of field, the longer distance, the larger the depth of field. The focal length, the shorter the focal length, the larger the depth of field, the longer the focal length, the narrower the depth of field. And shutter speeds. What are you going to use for a shutter speed? Well, outdoors, most people recommend a shutter speed of 1/1000th. It'll freeze the action for just about any sport that you can think of. Like think of football, rugby, baseball, outdoor basketball. But if you're photographing a fast speed sport, you might need to go up to 1/200th. Shutter speed indoors. With most indoor sports, you can get away with slower shutter speeds. And for some of the wheelchair sports, I've gone down to 1/320th. Now, when you're looking at websites, you're looking at Google, you're looking at YouTube talks from America about what speeds and shutter speeds they use for their sports. I don't know about the English stadiums, but the stadiums in Australia very rarely have strong lighting, very rarely have TV lighting on. And so the shutter speeds that we use in Australia will need to be different than the ones they show you on the American talk shows, because they have a lot better lighting system and they also have overhead flashes that can flash down. It's such a big difference in lighting in our stadiums. This was taken at 1/320th at Kevin Betts Stadium at Mount Druitt. It's power chair hockey, and this was a match of Victoria versus Queensland. What are you going to shoot in? Manual, shutter speed, or aperture? Depending on who you talk to, you'll get different answers. Some will say shoot mainly in manual. Others will say shoot mainly in shutter speed, while others say mainly aperture. I say whatever you think will work best for what you want, though I rarely use manual. I more often use aperture, but I will use shutter speed if I think the situation warrants it. But never set the sport setting on the main dial. Always go to one of the main settings, like manual, shutter speed, or aperture. Keep the sun to the back. Don't crimp, that is, don't spend time checking your images on the back of your camera while you're photographing the sport. That way you'll miss the best shots. Wait until there is a reasonable break in the action. As I said, if you check your images all the time, you may miss what the professionals call the money shot. And you could try auto ISO if your camera will allow it. I know some cameras have auto ISO up to about ISO 400 and then it runs out, where others will be able to adjust for the full range of the ISO. So check what your camera does. Focus on the players who will give you the best images. This is Riley Batt again. I said I often shoot with Riley as the main contributor because he's always in the action. He just keeps going and going. So see who's there. This is Australia playing New Zealand. The following images I'm going to show you now have received awards in national and international exhibitions. Unless it's otherwise noted, they refer to international awards. They will, of course, have been entered a different number of times in different exhibitions. One photo might have been entered 20 times, one might have been entered once. So as we go through them, this is Luka Sithole, a South African tennis player. You can see if you look down at the bottom, towards the bottom, he has no legs. He only has a short right arm and he plays left-handed. When Lucas was about 12 years old, he fell under a train and lost his arm and 2 legs. He used to play wheelchair rugby and now he plays international wheelchair tennis. And he's another one of the tennis players that I watch because of the different positions he gets himself into. Just like this one. Looks like he's going to fall out of the chair. This was played at the Sydney International Wheelchair Tennis a few years ago. They're usually in January or February. Then you have the athletics with high jumps and other events. And you can see the medals, all the mentions, all the merits I've got. And as you see down the bottom, national award, that's when we have a national competition. Bear tackled. This is a state of origin match between New South Wales and Queensland. Bear also played in the Invictus Games because he lost his leg in action. Part of our wheelchair rugby league. This is the 10-kilometre race around the rocks. It takes place every Australia Day. You may be forgiven for thinking that Hanoka won the race, but he didn't. He was nowhere near the leaders from memory. It was just that he was so excited to finish the 10-kilometre race. Quite often when I'm sitting there waiting for the winner to cross the line and to express a heck of a lot of joy, they just don't do so. They don't give you that photographic opportunity, but some of the others might. another one of our international tennis players, Adam. You can notice the blur of the racket and the ball at the top. This is Great Britain playing Japan in Sydney a few years ago. I was very close to the ring they were throwing the ball into, but I was standing up and I had to stand up. We had another photographer there that sat on the floor near the ring, and he had to get it out of the way in a heck of a hurry on one occasion. He managed to do it, but there could have been a drastic accident if he hadn't. Be aware of where you are. Be aware of whether you can stand there. Most of these events, because I'm a recognised photographer for the sport, even as an amateur, I'm allowed to stand on the edge of the court. I don't have to sit up in the grandstands. I just happened to turn around at the International Equestrian Centre and saw this shot and fired it off. And you'll often get cases where there's an accident, a misjump. The lady in the middle here is Vicky Roycroft, one of our older and best known past riders. This is Sithole again. This was played at the Blacktown Tennis Arena. This one was used by Australia in the Fiat black and white print biennial. The Razor Kings. These two are both people who have played internationally for Australia. Gary is one of the chaps I used to watch at the Whitewater Centre. Whenever you're at the Whitewater Centre and Gary was racing, you could be sure that he would get an expression on his face that was one of enduring photographic quality. Videos will often give you a good photograph. As I said before, at the Penrith Regatta Centre, the International Regatta Centre. This is one of the Swedish ladies who comes out to play in the international tennis. Andy. The reason I took this photo was because of the expression on Shingo's face. He's a Japanese competitor and he's also one of the best wheelchair tennis players and often takes out the competitions he's in. Whitewater race rafting. This is Ian Burrows, who now represents Australia at the Olympics. I just happened to catch this shot as I was leaving the stadium one day. I took this photo to show a wheelchair and a prosthesis leg. I put it on this competition in the camera club, and the judge who was there just flicked across it. He said, "I don't understand," and flicked across it. There's Gary again in the pairs. This is Canada, as you can see, playing Australia. The chap in the wheelchair there, in the Australian colours, he was going to be playing rugby league for one of our national rugby league teams. He was going back as a passenger in a car from a wedding practice. He asked the driver to stop so that he could fix up his seatbelt. The driver said, "Oh no, we're only about 5 minutes from home," and continued driving. And so he ended up in a wheelchair because the driver just wouldn't stop. we often have bike races down at the International Regatta Centre. These are just some of the ones. Now I'll show you some images from the sports I have photographed at local, national and international level. And when I say international level, they've all been within the Sydney region. The furthest I've travelled would be down to Shell Harbour, which is a few hours out of Sydney on the south coast, as far as taking photographs. We have so many international sports within Australia itself and within Sydney. We often go eventing. Involves 3 disciplines: dressage, cross-country and show jumping. And when you're photographing dressage, they like to see the horse with the A at the front and the back, the 2 A's made by the legs. And they want the A's to have the legs nearest you but stretched out, not the ones furthest away. So they like to see that A-frame. They also like to see the curve of the horse's leg, probably a little bit higher than in the front than what I've got it there, because they like to see that P shape as well. And of course we have the cross country, and they have so many different cross country jumps and so many different styles of jumps, and they change from time to time depending on who the course designer is. This one was taken down at Berrima, sort of a half bridge. Now with the show jumping, this image has 2 things that riders look for. They look for the front legs curled up, ready to go over the jump. They look for the body that is stretched out on. And of course, when you're photographing show jumping, get them going over the jump, and don't be afraid to get down low so you can get one from underneath. Of course, these days when I get down low, it's usually because my wife is there to help me get back up again. We had the opportunity to go to BMX National Championships in Newcastle. One of my wife's friends' children were doing BMX, and we asked if we could go and got permission from the organisers. So we went along and took some photos of that event. We were out in the country at one stage at Orange, saw on the local news that the National Dirt Bike Championships were going to be on at Blaney the next day, about half an hour's drive or so out of Orange. My wife remembers the days that her father used to take her to Sydney Showground for the bike races. And as we got nearer to the showground in Blaney, you could smell the bikes and the fuel from the bikes. And I got permission to photograph there, and we were able to go on the inside of the course to be able to get these photographs. Disabled water skiing. The New South Wales Water Skiing Association disabled section has a come and try day 6 days a year for people who have never tried it before. And they always have helpers there to help the disabled athletes. Here they are actually carrying this particular chap out of the water after he'd had a ride. And this is him in the ride. You'll see at the front of the water ski, there's a notch, and the rope goes through that with a knot on each side so that the athlete doesn't have to hang on to the rope, but can hang on to the sides. This chap had been in a wheelchair for just over 5 years. And this was basically the first time he'd been out of a wheelchair participating in sport, and he just smiled all the way through. We went out to Camel Racing at Forbes. You can see Camel Racing occasionally in Sydney. Not recently, of course, because of COVID-19. And this is the International Championships of Disabled Sailing I was talking about before. where I took 500 photographs and the other photographer took 5,000. They have two people in the Scud 18s. One is less able than the other. The one does the steering, the other looks after the sails. The girl in the back of this front boat was tied into the boat. She operated the steering with her feet. And the other chap who was with operated the sails. Now this first boat in this one, that's Liesl Tech. Liesl and her partner won the gold medal at the last two Olympics in Scud 18s. And we've been told that the Japanese Olympics aren't going to have Scud 18s. But Liesl was looking after the sails and her partner was looking after the steering. And Liesl has also represented Australia in 5 Olympic Games in wheelchair basketball. So I think out of a total, she's been in a total 7 Olympic Games. And recently, or last state election, she was elected to Parliament. We can see dragon boats in Sydney itself at Darling Harbour or down at the International Regatta Centre. This is just a couple of shots from dragon boats. There's also flat water canoes down there. And there's also the other canoes. One day I was down there photographing and I was up the top of the observation tower. I rang my wife and said, I'm at the top of the observation tower. I've been allowed to go up there. And she said, well, I always knew your photography would take you to great heights. And I said, Whitewater Stadium. This is one I showed you before. Ian Burrows, one of our Olympians. Another chap who was putting a nice face. And then we have the Illawarra Festival of Basketball each year down at Shell Harbour, where we get teams from most of the states in Australia and from New Zealand. And unfortunately, it wasn't on this year because of COVID-19, but it's every year. And I like to get these shots, the shots where the ball has been thrown up by the umpire and the people are stretching out to get the ball. Then you can always make a triptych of your wheelchair basketball photos showing the ball being thrown and going through the net. It's a wonderful way of displaying them. This is Power Chair Football Nationals in Mount Druitt. It's the wheelchair version of soccer. In this case, we have Queensland playing Victoria. And you notice how the Victorian chap in the black has got a mask for breathing. And there are a lot of disabled people that play these sports. Here we have the Newcastle Jets playing the Western Sydney Wanderers. This is Power Chair Hockey. Power Chair Hockey is played with a stick if you can hold it, or if you see in the middle of the photograph, a little paddle on the bottom of Kieran's chair. So you have the option of a stick or you have the paddle on the bottom. And this is Australia playing Canada late last year. This is one of our local games, and you'll see there that it includes women, and that's ABS, who I showed you before in the orange. And this is Push and Power Rugby League. They don't use a rugby league ball, they use a tennis ball. And the tennis ball is basically used for scoring the goals. To score a try, you've got to get across the line. And you either have to touch the player or touch the player's chair to become a tackle. And as you'll see, people can play no matter, regardless of what their deficiency is in many ways. This chap here uses a prod on the front of with his chin just to play wheelchair push and power. Wheelchair Rugby League, I showed you this one before, the state of origin, with the bear in the centre. That's his nickname, and he plays a few other sports as well, a disabled serviceman. And here is the Australia team at the top and the English wheelchair team at the bottom when England came out last year to play against Australia. And sad to say, Australia lost every match. But it was wonderful to be there and to see the matches and to see the people playing Wheelchair Rugby League. Now, Wheelchair Rugby League is one of the wheelchair sports where you can have a mixture of both the able-bodied and the disabled. It's not as forceful as the wheelchair rugby, which was once known as murder ball, but it's a great sport to watch. And the third one from the left with the little bit of a beard on it, that's the bear who I showed you before. Of course, this is England getting ready to kick the ball. Now, don't forget when you're doing these things that you can have the opportunity of taking team photos. This is the team that played wheelchair basketball in the Paralympics for Australia a few years ago. And wheelchair basketball is one of the sports that Australians are good at, like wheelchair rugby. Now, some of these sports you won't see in the Olympics, like the power chair football and the power chair hockey, because for every one of those people who go, they've got to take a carer with them. Whereas these other ones, they don't need a carer for every player. Then there's the presentations. The presentations are a wonderful time to get photographs of the athletes at their happiest because of the way they can hold the trophy and have that moment of success and that moment of joy holding the trophy. And then when I take a photo like this, I always try to get the person in the middle at the front holding the ball. If it was a hockey game, I would have them holding hockey sticks. So you try and get part of the sporting equipment into it. And also when I take photographs like this, because in many cases I'm the official photographer as the volunteer, I say to them, look at me. You can look at all the other people out there taking photographs later. Look at me. And of course, when there's kids in your team photo, you say, look at me. You can look at mum when she's taking a photograph. Because if you just take photographs without directing them to look at you, you'll get them looking all over the place. And you always take more than one shot, because you'll find if you take one shot, somebody will have their eyes closed or their head will be looking a different way. So I always insisted they'd look at you and you take a few shots first, and then all the parents and bystanders can come and take shots as well. Now also, we had this player down there on the right-hand side, the one in the red and black stripes, the one at the front there. He decided he was going to try and break the Guinness Book of Records. The previous record for spinning on the spot in a wheelchair was 32. And he did over 130 spins in a minute. And when he'd finished spinning, he didn't even need the garbage can with the plastic bag in it that they had ready for him. I'm sure that if I'd been doing that, I would have definitely used the garbage bag. But he 130 odd revolutions in a minute. And sometimes you get the opportunity to be there and to take these photos. And the officials. So often officials can have looks on their faces. Here he's telling some of the players to cool down. This chap's a school teacher as well as a referee, and he referees in the Olympics as well as in the national and international sports. Then there's the entertainers. This particular lass was the entertainer at the beginning of the wheelchair race around the rocks. And you can often get photographs of people entertaining. On one occasion, in one of the wheelchair sports, the person who was there doing the entertaining was Jimmy Barnes. So they can be well-known artists as well as just artists that look beautiful and sing well. So don't forget them. And then don't forget the spectators. We were down at Berrima photographing the cross country. We were using our SLRs with our big lenses. We hear this voice behind us, make way for the good photographer, make way for the special photographer. And this chap, Russell, who was the first time we met him, walked up with his little point and shoot. Didn't worry us, but we became friends at that occasion and we still correspond with each other. He lives some 2 hours away from where we live. But he was a nice bloke. Well, that brings me to the end of my presentation today. I don't know whether anybody has any questions they want to ask, but I'm stopping there and I will stop the share so we can go back onto the other screen. And I'll get rid of that. Right. Over to you, Alan.
I've got one. You mentioned using a very high ISO, particularly for your indoor shots, but your images seem so clear. Do you do a lot of processing to get rid of the noise?
Oh, well, I did some noise reduction, yes. But they mightn't be as clear as they look if you put them up onto an A3 size, because it's very difficult to get noise out of photos. My main program for my photography is Lightroom. I use Lightroom most of the time, and they tell me even the professionals now use Lightroom 95% of the time and only go to Photoshop. I know people still use their priority programs, but Lightroom's good. It's okay by me, and it keeps improving over the years. And of course, with sports photography, or you can't do too much with it, but you can sharpen it. You can alter the colours to be what they were when you were there and crop it.
William, you said that you took photographs at venues 4 or 5 times a week. Is that all?
Oh, not quite that number.
All right. You must travel around.
Sydney, yeah.
Is it all in the Sydney area, or are you travelling further afield?
Most of it's in the Sydney area. The ones of the basketball at Shell Harbour, that's about 2 hours away. And I live in Penrith. In Penrith, we have the International Regatta Centre. We have the International Whitewater Centre Stadium, both left over from the Olympics. We're only quarter of an hour, 20 minutes away from the International Equestrian Centre. And most of the polo, horse polo that's played in Sydney is played at Richmond, which is only half an hour away from our place.
Wow. Yeah.
If you drive around Richmond, you'll see the Windsor Polo Club, the Sydney Polo Club, the Curry Polo Club. They're all got different ones. So most of them are in Sydney, and some of the basketball ones are down at Sydney University, where the Sydney Flames play.
Yeah. You don't have to.
Oh, a lot of them, a lot of those other ones you saw of power chair hockey and power chair football, they're at Mount Druitt, about 25 minutes away, at a stadium that's run by Wheelchair Sports New South Wales.
You've certainly got scope for an awful lot of different sports within a fair range, fair closeness, haven't you? Fantastic.
Yes, don't have to travel far.
Yeah, fantastic.
You obviously have a passion, and it comes through very clearly in supporting wheelchair sports, and I'm sure that, you know, people of that level of disability, if you want to call it that, are very appreciative of the fact that there is somebody there who's prepared to put their sports out front and centre. But you seem to be totally amateur yourself, as you say, but you seem to be focusing totally on amateur sports. Do you ever go to professional events, fully professional events? I'm thinking of professional rugby league, for instance, Aussie rules, perhaps rugby union, or even cricket at the SCG. Do you ever go to those and find a good place to take a photograph?
I haven't been to most of those professional sports. I did photograph at one stage for the Penrith Emus rugby union team, but they had a record of about 50 defeats in a row. And I have been down to watch Penrith Panthers play occasionally, but the problem is when they're on, because I've got wheelchair sports on most weekends.
Yeah.
And so you don't get to the professional ones.
Yeah.
There is a lass called Kylie Gauchi who plays wheelchair basketball, and her mother is at every one of her matches unless Penrith's playing at home. And that gets priority over her daughter's basketball. You'll see Kylie in the Paralympics if you get to watch those as well.
Fantastic.
I was surprised to see that there's no surfing pictures. Is there a reason for that?
No, I've never done real surfing pictures. I know I could, but the wheelchair sports take up so much time.
Mm.
You do live quite away from the surf, though, William.
From the
Surf.
to get to the surf would take us an hour and a half, 2 hours to get to.
Right.
You remember a player called Greg Alexander?
Yep.
Yeah, I was at his first match when he was, I think he was 17 when he first played for him.
Yeah, what, you were out here then?
Yeah, I used to live there.
Ah, whereabouts?
In Sydney.
Oh, not in Penrith.
No. I lived in Castle Hill.
Ah, yeah. Well, when in those days that you're talking about, would have been back before I went into the country in the ministry, and a friend of mine and myself used to go to all the rugby league matches the Panthers played around Sydney. In those days, they didn't play in Brisbane or Darwin or Western Australia or Melbourne. It was all around Sydney. And we used to be at the matches most weekends. But that was before I really got stuck back into photography for my retirement.
Of course, Sydney used to have 16 teams, didn't they?
Yeah.
I don't know how many they've got now.
Always the best. I've been following Penrith practically the whole of their time, and I follow them through thick and thin. I did live in Penrith back in the 1950s when my father was a drill instructor at the police training centre, and then back in Penrith in the 70s, and then back to Penrith in 2006.
Do you have your own church, or are you a travelling minister?
I'm retired.
Okay.
Yeah, I said to somebody one day that I was Minister Emeritus, and they went, "Oh, wow." I didn't realise that emeritus meant retired. I turned 80 last Monday.
Very
But I
good.
am preaching at Auburn on the 17th of January.
Yeah.
I fill in occasionally where needed to, and I still take part in looking after little kids in our preschool and things like that at the church, our play centres.
Okay, any more questions, anybody?
I mean, if you like, I can give you a sermon.
I think we might need one. The way the state we're in.
Say a few words. Yeah.
Oh, you want to hear one?
Joking.
Okay.
Oh, I do tell people Canons are the only cameras allowed into heaven because they're the only perfect ones.
No comment.
And I tell people,
Join us next week when we've got an Olympus guru, and you'll probably change your mind.
I think if you've been
you
using Canon for a long time, you probably will not be changing now.
No.
I've had Canon for years.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the best photographs I ever saw of the Blaisville Presbyterian Church was taken in the 80s by an old bloke on his box brownie.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, it's not the camera basically; it's the person behind the camera that makes
Yeah.
a great deal of difference.
Yeah. True.
But I do get some fun. I get some funny looks when I tell people I married my granddaughter. I've married 2 of my granddaughters, and I'm marrying a grandson in January.
Very good.
Yeah.
People who don't know my occupation get a very queer look on their face.
That must have been really special.
And it has been interesting joining you and talking to the other side of the world.
Thank you very much,
I've
William.
Yeah,
I've never been there.
Yeah.
I'm
thank
not
you.
likely to go there, even though my ancestry is Scottish and English, with a bit of Irish thrown in.
Oh dear. You'll upset Wales then.
I don't think we got any Welsh people. There's a few families like the name of Sweet and Nam, Sweet with NAM on the end instead of MAN. And I'm supposed to be related to every one of those in Australia.
Oh.
Because my ancestors settled up basically around the Bathurst area.
Mm.
Bathurst, Oberon, if you know those places.
I know the Bathurst race that goes up into the
Yeah, Mount Panorama.
yeah.
What
Yeah,
have you
I've driven
got
around.
planned?
Sorry,
What have you got planned for the rest of the day? Your day's just starting.
I'm just going to relax now, probably go back to bed. I was up by about 4:45 to get ready and
Oh
have
God.
breakfast
Yeah.
and so forth.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed that. It's very informative, inspiring, and very entertaining as well. So thank you very much. That I really enjoyed it.
Commitment to those people.
Thank you for your kind words.
Yeah.
And I'd like to
Lovely.
thank William as well, because when Alan and Mary sent out the request for some speakers, William being William, immediately responded and offered to do this sports talk for you this morning. And I've seen William do this type of presentation in the past, and I found this one particularly good and very inspiring, as William always is with his sports photography. So I'd like to thank William very much for doing this for you, and so quickly responding to the request. So thank you, William.
Yeah. Thank you. It's brilliant.
Thank you for that, Peter.
I'm also very positive with my sermons.
Right. Any more questions, anybody? I don't want to cut anybody off.
fine. Thank
Well, it's now just about 8 o'clock in Australia,
Right.
which means what? It's 10 o'clock over there? No, 9 o'clock.
It's about 9.
9 o'clock.
It's 9 o'clock, 5 minutes to
9
9. Thank you very
Oh,
much,
you must-
William. From
Thank you.
from Haxie and its members, I'd like to thank you. Very informative, very interesting, and some superb photographs.
Here, here.
Here, here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, really good.
I look,
Peter,